Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor. I'm Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Today's question is short and sweet. Dear Pastor, does the Council of Serdica support the papacy? All right, the answer is no. But to understand why that's the answer, we need to understand why there was a Council of Serdica in the first place and what the Council of Serdica decided. So this council met in 343. This was 18 years after the Council of Nicaea. And the most important thing to understand about the period between Council of Nicaea in 325 and Council of Constantinople in 381, the most important thing to understand is that the Council of Nicaea did not bring peace and tranquility to the church at that point. If anybody tells you that Council of Nicaea fixed things, they haven't cracked open their church history book in a while. It was an extremely tumultuous time in the church. And that's because the Nicene Creed and its terminology was suspect for so much of this period as being Sabellian. So people were leery then that when the Creed taught that the Father and the Son are homoousios, that is, of the same substance, of the same essence, they were tempted to take that to mean that they are the same person, the same subject. On the other side of things, you had the supporters of Arius, who we're going to call the Eusebians because of their leader, Eusebius of Nicomedia. The Eusebians continued during this period to harass the church with multiple variations of Arius's teaching, these mutations of Arius's teachings. They also then wrote multiple and various creeds in an attempt to displace the Nicene Creed. That was their first weapon against the truth, the making of new creedal statements. The other weapon, though, which they wielded quite well against the church, was deposing pro-Nicene bishops from their offices. So in 335, the Eusebians convened a council in Tyre, in northern Palestine. And they brought charges against Athanasius of Alexandria, charges of malfeasance in office. The council readmitted Arius to communion, contrary to the fact that Nicaea had condemned him and his doctrine. The council deposed Athanasius from his see, and then also appointed a new replacement bishop in Alexandria. Athanasius, in response to this, fled to Constantinople for an audience with the emperor. And then a few hours later, the Eusebian party arrived there as well from Tyre. The council's decision, after the emperor heard this, was rendered null and void by the emperor's desire to hear the case. And so then, in response to this, the Eusebians invented a new charge. Athanasius had threatened the grain supply from Alexandria. This would have been a serious blow to the emperor's new capital at Constantinople. So he exiled Athanasius to Trier in Germany. Now, Constantine did not formally depose him, nor did he formally try him. This was more of a suspension pending further investigation. Nor did Constantine recognize the bishop that the Council of Tyre that they had elected to replace Athanasius. Now, 2 years later then, in 337, when Constantine died, all exiled bishops were allowed to return to their dioceses. However, in 339, the Eusebians, this time armed with a guard on loan from the Eastern Emperor, Constantius, they consecrated Gregory as the Bishop of Alexandria. At this, Athanasius fled to Rome at the invitation of Julius, who was the Bishop of Rome at the time. Julius held a council in Rome in 340, and that council declared Athanasius, it cleared him of all charges, it admitted him into communion, and restored him to his see. It also did this for other pro-Nicene bishops, Marcellus of Ankara and Asclepius of Gaza. They were also reinstated by that council. Now this, along with the Eusebians' formulation of more creeds which denied God the Son's divinity, this led Julius, the Bishop of Rome, and others within the church to petition the emperors at the time, to convene a council to fix the doctrinal divisions in the church. That was, or would have been, the Council of Serdica. So the Emperor Constans called a council to meet in Serdica, which was modern Sofia in Bulgaria. However, the Council of Serdica went sideways from the very get-go. It didn't even fully meet. The Eastern bishops, they refused to meet with the Western bishops when they saw that the Western bishops wanted to seat Athanasius, Marcellus, and Asclepius as members of the council. That would mean that they would have to revisit their depositions, and that would mean that they would have to suspend their previous judgments. So, being unwilling to do this, the Eastern bishops withdrew to the city of Philippopolis, 100 miles southeast of Serdica, and also under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Emperor, Constantius. And there they convened their own council. They issued an encyclical letter to the whole church explaining the case against Athanasius and Marcellus. That council also excommunicated Julius, Bishop of Rome, and other prominent Western bishops. What this means is that 343 marks the first official schism between the Eastern and Western churches. The bishops that actually did meet at Serdica, though, the mostly Western bishops, did make important contributions to understanding the Nicene Creed. However, that wouldn't be capitalized until the 370s by the Cappadocians. That, as we say around here, is another Bible study. Now, aside from the doctrinal discussions at Serdica, the Western bishops established several canons, or ecclesiastical laws. These canons forbade the transference of bishops from one see to another, the interference of a bishop in another bishop's see, poaching clerics from others' jurisdictions, and it forbade uninvited visits to the imperial court. Now, for our question about the Council of Serdica supporting the papacy, or to what extent it did, the most important canons, are the appeals canons, canons 3, 4, and 7. And of those, the most important one is canon 3. Here's how the pertinent part of canon 3 reads. This also is to be provided. If perhaps in any province some bishop shall have had a matter in dispute against his brother bishop, neither of these shall call in bishops from another province to arbitrate. But if some bishop has been judged, or shall have been judged in some matter, and thinks that he has a good case, and if the judgment should be reconsidered, if it please you, let us honor the memory of the blessed Peter, the apostle, and let a letter be written to the Roman bishop, either by those who heard the case, or by the bishops who reside in a neighboring province. If he, the Roman bishop, shall decide that the trial is to be held again, let it be repeated, and let him appoint judges. But if he determines that the case is such that what has been enacted should not be reopened, what he has decreed shall be confirmed. Now, what this canon is doing is establishing an appeals process for a bishop who thinks he's been wrongfully deposed. Prior to this, there was no appeal process. There was no a formal way to appeal a council's decision. The fifth canon of the Council of Nicaea had directed each province to hold councils twice a year, and those councils would act as an appellate court for deposed bishops and clergy. But the Nicene canon didn't provide any appeals process for those deposed or excommunicated at those provincial councils. Canon 4 of Serdica then stipulates that a bishop is appealing his deposition. Another bishop is not to be ordained in his place until the bishop's judgment. Fighting what happened there at the Council of Tyre. Canon 7 also adds that the condemned may present his case before the Roman bishop himself, because otherwise the right to appeal wouldn't have any real teeth to it. It wouldn't have any application. So, what does this canon actually prescribe? And does it support the papacy? Well, the deposed bishop could appeal to the Bishop of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome could either let that judgment stand, or he could reopen the case, appointing judges to retry it. Does this mean that by 343, Western bishops thought the Roman bishop had the authority of jurisdiction over all other bishops within Christendom, bishops not within the See of Rome? Well, the leading scholar on the Council of Serdica and the development of canon law, Hamilton Hess, he argues rather convincingly that the bishops at Serdica deferred to the Roman bishop out of primacy of honor, not because of authority of jurisdiction. So the Bishop of Rome, he argues, held the primacy of honor, not authority. Therefore, the only capacity in which the Bishop of Rome could judge a case is as a fellow bishop. Hess also argues that in the early church, canons weren't viewed as legally binding, but that bishops and clergy had a moral obligation to observe them. And that makes sense and explains why many canons, even those promulgated at Serdica, were dormant for decades and never followed. There's even one instance from the 5th century where the African churches rejected Roman jurisdiction in an appeals case and forbade African clerics to appeal beyond the sea. So the appeal canons of Serdica, they aren't a witness to a universal papal primacy. The primacy of the Bishop of Rome in the early church was one of honor, not of universal jurisdiction. The Serdican appeals canons did, however, influence later development of papal primacy and claims of universal jurisdiction, but that's another episode. Hope this helps. We'll see you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.